A couple special guests this morning, Evan, but first, what's for lunch today starting at 11 o'clock at Pullman's My Office Bar and Grill?
Soup special is prime rib chili, and your lunch entree special, grilled turkey bacon sandwich. My Office Bar and Grill, downtown Pullman. Open for lunch today starting at 11 o'clock.
Well, special guests this morning, Terry Buffington and her son Kawasi. Amazing, you've landed here in the Pullman-Moscow area, but you're both from Oxford, Mississippi, and you are bringing some perspective on black history to an area that maybe has some voids there. And this is going to be really interesting. You have a foundation. You're putting a couple of events on here in the Pullman-Moscow area during Black History Month, which is next month. And first of all, hey, thank you very much for getting up and coming in to visit with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
We're delighted to be here, and thank you all for having us.
Thank you very much.
Now, Terry, you are a cultural anthropologist.
Correct.
And you are from the University of Mississippi, Oxford, Mississippi, which is, of course, right down in the middle of the South. You personally were born under Jim Crow. And just a quick definition, if you were to give a short version of what Jim Crow is or was, how do you define what was going on in the South under Jim Crow post-Civil War?
Jim Crow was a legal form of segregation that separated black people and white people, and it limited the opportunities for black people for employment, education, housing, and it was a rigid system where you had to follow the Jim Crow rules of segregation by walking on off of the sidewalk when a white person approached you, being careful what you said. You could run the risk of being killed or had to leave town in a hurry. So it was a harsh system of segregation, intimidation, lynching, fleeing the city. So it was a rough life to live in the Jim Crow South.
And you were around back when Jim Crow started to break down, when actions by yourself and people you knew started breaking Jim Crow down.
Well, let me tell you a bit about how all of this came about for me. I was born and raised in a little town called West Point, Mississippi, which is in the northeast part of the state. It borders Columbus, Mississippi, and Mississippi State, where the late coach just passed away. I'm a 12-minute drive from those two universities. And as a child growing up, we were aware of the Jim Crow law because your parents would warn you about how you behaved and what you said, and be careful of your manners around white people. So it was a rigid kind of a life for a kid to grow up in. The 1965, I graduated high school in 64 at 15. By then, the civil rights movement, Ella Baker, had made it possible for people like Stokley Carmichael, Martin Luther King, to come into the communities. And so the Freedom House was 3 houses up the street from my house. And so I had to walk past the Freedom House to get to the other end of the street. And one day I was walking by and looked in the mailbox, and this guy came out and said to me, "What are you doing looking in the mailbox?" And I said, "I want to know who lives here." So this guy ended up being my husband, John Buffington. And so now the thing about the civil rights movement that I want to mention is, had it not been for young black teenage men, it would have been a difficult job for Dr. King to reach the mountaintop. It was black teenage young men that opened the black community doors so that the civil rights movement could come into our neighborhoods. Black people were terrified. Some would run and holler and scream when they saw us coming, or would pull guns on us when we knocked on the door for registration as we were canvassing, because people were afraid that they would be hung, you would lose your job, and sometimes the authorities would ride around and take down license plates to see if you were at a meeting like the NAACP and report you to your boss if you had one. You didn't have a job. So it was a harsh system. And so the effort was to tear down Jim Crow. And that's exactly what we did. But the Freedom Summer movement was about registration in 1964. Now, I grew up just a minute down the street from where those three civil rights workers was killed. So civil rights was in the air starting way back in the 50s in the Arkansas school desegregation case. So we were all bracing for it. And then Meredith came along in 62. And so where we had 2 people killed on campus at Ole Miss, Kennedy sent in the National Guard. So the civil rights movement, I want people to understand that it was a Southern movement, exclusively in the South, and that would be primarily Alabama, where the late Congressman John Lewis lived, and I was just right across the border over in Mississippi, some 30 miles from the Alabama state line. And so they all kind of go right together. John Lewis was a young guy, I was a young person, and these black men that I interviewed were young.
Wow.
And Terry, before we talk about your events coming up here where you can bring this home to our folks here in Palouse, I got to ask, how did you folks land here on the Palouse, and you're here talking to us here in Pullman about your foundation before we talk about these events? How did you end up here?
That's a great question. So I returned to college in 2013 after leaving the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago as a lighting technician for about 8 years, and decided to get my BFA in lighting design at the University of Mississippi. So in 2013 I returned back to school, graduated in 2017, immediately went to grad school, and I'm looking on the computer and I see the Google Maps, and I see these little red dots.
Yeah. And
I'm clicking. I'll start off in Colorado because I have friends out in the Pacific Northwest and in the West that I went to school with. And most of the places didn't have, the colleges were lacking on-campus housing, so that was sort of a problem. So it led me further north, and now I'm in the state of Washington, started in Colorado, California, Oregon, moved up north on the map, Seattle, and didn't have on-campus housing. Looked over here and clicked on a dot, and I thought I was in Washington State, and it said University of Idaho.
There you go.
I said, oh, wonderful. Then it had everything that I was searching for, especially on-campus housing.
Okay.
So I said, hey, Mom, I'm going back. I'm going to grad school. You can come with me, or you can stay here in Mississippi and continue your pursuits. And she decided to come with. So we came here.
That's great.
Went to school. 2020, the pandemic hit. And things kind of slowed down, and we started the Terry Buffington Productions and the Terry Buffington Foundation last year with our collection as it was digitized through the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Okay. And so that's what a lot of the focus of are these events at the Gladish and Pullman for next month. Stuff you're doing with the Terry Buffington Foundation. Terry, we've got a few minutes left in these events. The first one, February 17th through the 19th, Born Under Jim Crow, Eddie Brooks Tapes Stage Reading. That's the first thing coming up.
Yes. In the Terry Buffington papers at the University of North Carolina, there are 740 items. And as a part of the collection, there's a series of oral narratives, Eddie Brooks and 21 other people. And all of these men were born under Jim Crow, 1930s, 40s, and few of them in the 20s. And so the Eddie Brooks reading is coming from the transcript edited by Kawasaki. So we want to bring it to the stage so we can give a clear view of what the South was like in the 60s. And Eddie Brooks was a 17-year-old kid when he came to Mississippi from Chicago. And so that is what's important and unique. I want students to know that they too can take a stand as 17-year-olds.
Wow. And then lastly, and we want to get that in there too, because we're almost out of time.
Yes.
But on February 3rd, the Ella Baker premiere film will be at the Gladish too.
And southern fried catfish and buttermilk cornbread and collard greens and black-eyed peas and iced tea. Southern pecan pie.
Southern fried chicken.
Are you kidding?
Southern fried buttermilk chicken.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm
Pecan
serious.
pie.
Pecan pie.
Sweet tea.
We got the Mississippi farm-raised catfish that I had shipped in here. And
Jazz music.
Jazz
Live
music.
jazz band.
The Idaho, Washington orchestras providing the music.
Silent auction.
Silent auction, and the Center for Civic Engagement is sending me 17 volunteer students to help serve the food.
Thank you, Wazoo.
And thank you, Wazoo. And so is the Morrow Communication School. They have just been wonderful in the Gladish because I am on the mayor's new committee for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And it's important, I think, that I'm an educator. It's important that we educate the community about this part of our American history. I don't see it as Black history. It's American history. It is what our country was like in the 21st century. And here we are in the 20th century. And here we are in the 21st century with some of those same threads that are running through our communities, voters' right issues. So, drawing from the Terry Buffington papers, I decided to take the collection and utilize it to the stage, but also create a scholarship for Washington State University Department of Anthropology so that a minority student can go into this discipline and be able to learn to do the things that I've done to record and capture the Black experience, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah.
We are out of time, but we've got those dates again in February, 17th to the 19th, and then the big dinner and the premiere of the movie on the 3rd of February. And we'll be passing all that stuff along as we get closer as well. But thank you so much for coming in. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Very welcome.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Kawasi. We are Bill and Evan, and this is your Wednesday Morning News.